Do you remember the smell of toast before it came from a machine, when it was held over a fire and turned by hand? Do you remember when breakfast wasn't rushed, when a single egg in a story could last an hour? Britain once had a taste, not of salt or sugar, but of patience, of something made slowly and shared fully. Before supermarkets, before delivery apps, food wasn't just eaten, it was earned, expected, celebrated. What did Sunday taste like where you grew up? For some, it was roast beef and gravy, thick as a memory. For others, just bread, butter, and gratitude. Every smell was a promise. Onions in a pan, tea brewing in the pot, pastry crisping in the oven. And every home had its own sound of supper, its own rhythm of hunger and comfort. Do you remember when biscuits came in tins, not plastic? When you opened one and it smelled of Christmas no matter the month? The taste of Britain once lived in small rituals. Things done not for luxury, but for love. Tea wasn't a drink, it was punctuation. It ended every worry and started every conversation. The kettle didn't just boil water, it boiled time itself, softening the day into something bearable. What happened to that kind of quiet? When did flavour stop meaning something more than taste? A generation learned to make meals from nothing. Flour, lard, and stubborn hope. Every recipe was a memory passed down, not written down. And the best cooks never measured, because they'd lived the ingredients. Did your nan have a wooden spoon older than you? Mine did. And she used it like a baton, conducting the music of ordinary life. Every kitchen had a smell, not fancy, but unforgettable. Stew bubbling low, bread cooling on a sill, tea leaves drying by the stove. You could tell what street you were on just by the scent of supper. Now, we eat fast, we scroll faster, and the silence of a simmering pot feels almost foreign. When did dinner become something to finish instead of share? The Britain that fed the world once fed itself with grace, not greed. Fish and chips wrapped in yesterday's paper. Do you remember licking the salt from your fingers? It wasn't just a meal, it was a language. Everyone spoke it, no accent required. Pies on the counter, pudding steaming on Sundays, a warmth you could taste. And yet most of it's gone. The shops, the smells, the patience. We've gained speed, but we've lost flavour. We've gained options, but we've lost ritual. Ask yourself, when was the last time you actually smelled your food before you ate it? When was the last time it reminded you of someone instead of someone? The taste of Britain isn't in restaurants, it's in memory. It lives in every chipped mug, every burnt edge, every imperfect meal that somehow felt perfect. So maybe this isn't about nostalgia. Maybe it's about remembering who we were through what we ate. Because taste is time, and time once lost can't be reheated. The question is, do we still know how to savour anything at all? Understood, now we're going cinematic. There was a time when every meal began hours before anyone sat down. When the sound of a knife against a wooden board meant that something real was happening. Not for an audience, not for a post, but because feeding someone was the purest kind of love. The smell of roasting vegetables would drift through the hallway, mingling with the sound of the wireless and the clatter of cutlery being laid out with quiet precision. Every motion, a small act of devotion disguised as routine. You could tell the day of the week just by what was on the table. Friday meant fish, Sunday meant roast, and Monday was whatever could be made from what was left. It wasn't waste. It was wisdom, learned the hard way and passed down like a secret recipe written in muscle memory instead of ink. Do you remember the way gravy would run into the mashed potatoes like a river? Or the sound of crust cracking when a pie was cut open and the steam escaped like a sigh of relief from the day itself? Back then, flavour wasn't measured in spice or status. It was measured in care, in the hands that made it, in the patience that seasoned it better than anything from a jar. There was a rhythm to it all. The scrape of a spoon, the soft bubbling from a pot, the steady hum of conversation rising and falling like waves on a familiar shore. Even the silence of eating together felt full, like everyone was quietly agreeing that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Do you remember that moment before dinner began, when everyone just paused, not for grace, but for gratitude? Not the kind you post, but the kind you feel in your chest, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of something older than you. Every dish had a story, every recipe had a face, and the taste of it lingered long after the plates were cleared and the chairs pushed back. Outside, the world might have been rebuilding, inventing, speeding up, but inside, time stood still, just long enough for bread to rise. No one talked about mindfulness because it already lived in every stirring spoon, every slow simmer, every hand that waited rather than hurried. And when dessert came, even if it was just tinned fruit and evaporated milk, it felt like a reward for existing, for getting through another ordinary miracle of a day. We've forgotten how to wait for things, haven't we? We fill every silence, fill every second, But nothing tastes right when you never stop moving. What if the soul of Britain wasn't in its empire or inventions, but in its ovens, in the patience of people who believed that slow was sacred? They didn't talk about love, they served. And somehow, even now, the air of old kitchens seems to hold on to that, a smell of onions, flour, and faith in tomorrow. There's something holy about remembering those who cooked without expecting applause, because every time you peel a potato or pour tea into a chipped cup, you're part of the same quiet lineage, an unbroken chain of care, stretching through generations that never wrote their names in history books. They left their legacy not in words but in warmth, in recipes that never needed measuring, in laughter that lived longer than any meal. Ask yourself, when was the last time food made you feel seen? When did a flavor ever take you home instead of somewhere new? In the end, taste is memory made visible. It's how we time travel without machines, how we meet the ghosts we loved most without saying their name. Britain's forgotten flavors aren't lost, they're waiting, quietly, inside us, under layers of noise and novelty. Maybe the future won't be found in invention at all, but in returning to the table, because that's where we've always found ourselves. Not on screens, not in slogans, but over steaming plates and soft laughter. And maybe that's the real revolution, to slow down long enough to taste what's real, to realize that progress means nothing if you can't savor it. So if you still remember the sound of the kettle, the smell of baked bread, the scrape of a chair on a kitchen floor, don't let it fade. That's your inheritance. That's your proof that you were part of something beautiful. Because flavor, like memory, never truly disappears. It just waits, quietly, patiently, for someone to care enough to bring it back to life. There are still corners of Britain where the past hasn't been paved over, where the scent of baking bread drifts through an open door and makes strangers feel like family. In seaside towns, you can still find chip shops that smell exactly like they did 60 years ago. Salt, vinegar, newsprint, and laughter layered thick in the air. You take that first bite, and suddenly you're 8 years old again, sitting on a wall with greasy fingers and no idea how good the world can taste. That's the power of memory. It doesn't age, it just hides until you give it a reason to return. Every region still carries echoes of its own flavour. Black pudding in the north, pasties in the south, cockles by the sea, tea everywhere. Food was never just food, it was geography you could taste. A map drawn in flavour and family. Do you remember market days when the stalls buzzed with voices, coins, and the smell of something frying that made everyone stop? There was no branding, no slogans, just faces. And every one of them knew someone your mother knew. The butcher who slipped an extra sausage into the paper because he liked your dad. The baker who saved a loaf because he knew you'd be late. Those weren't transactions, they were trust, baked daily and wrapped in kindness. Now we scan, tap, and leave without a word, and we wonder why everything feels colder. We've traded eye contact for efficiency, stories for receipts, and flavour for shelf life. But memory doesn't fade easily. It clings like sugar to fingertips, refusing to be washed away. Britain used to celebrate food, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. Do you remember the smell of toast on rainy mornings, when fog pressed against the glass and home felt like the whole world? That wasn't nostalgia, that was true. Life then wasn't better, but it was slower, and maybe that's what made it beautiful. Because to savour something, you have to stay long enough to taste it. In every kitchen, there was a story simmering of love, loss, laughter, and stubborn survival. Those recipes weren't written in cookbooks. They were written in hands and hearts. And when the next generation forgot them, something more than flavour disappeared. And waiting gave you space to think, to listen, to notice the way sunlight moved across the table as the hours passed. Do you remember when you could taste the season in your meal? The frost in the potatoes, the summer in the berries, the rain in the bread. Back then, weather and hunger were part of the same rhythm, both reminders that you were alive and connected to something larger than yourself. Now, everything tastes like nowhere, like nothing in particular. Food that fills you, but doesn't remember you. There's no story in it, no fingerprints, no trace of the person who made it. We've created food without memory, and in doing so, we've built lives without flavor. Once to cook was to love. A wordless act of devotion that said, I see you, I know you, I'm here. We lost the art of making time, the patience to let things unfold without hurry. Have you noticed how modern food rarely smells of anything real? It's pretty, packaged, sterile, but it doesn't whisper, doesn't linger, doesn't remember. The old meals weren't perfect, but they told the truth of who we were, where we lived, and how we cared for one another. If progress means forgetting what made us human, then maybe it's time to slow down again. To let the bread rise on its own, to let the stew thicken naturally, to let hunger return like an honest friend. Because there's something ancient in the act of waiting. It makes you notice, it makes you grateful, it makes you alive. And maybe the next revolution won't come from machines or markets, but from kitchen, from 1,000 small acts of remembering. A grandmother's pie, a father's roast, a cup of tea left steaming for someone who's late. Britain's story isn't written in monuments. It's written in flavour, in scent, in shared silence between bites. So the next time you eat something simple, close your eyes. Ask yourself, who taught me this taste? Whose hands made this possible? That's history, that's legacy, that's love, served warm, humble, and real. And if we can taste it again, maybe we can remember who we were before we hurried past it all. Ask yourself, when did a meal last feel like a story? When did you stop to think about who once stood where you stand now, stirring the same pot and tasting for the same reason? Not to impress, but to belong. The smell of something cooking used to mean safety. A signal that someone, somewhere, was thinking of you, that you were expected, that you mattered enough for time to be taken. Now, the hum of microwaves has replaced the crackle of pans, and silence sits at tables where conversation once danced between bites and pauses. There was a time when families didn't need to plan dinner. They simply arrived, drawn in by instinct, by the scent of something too honest to ignore. Even hunger back then had warmth to it. It carried anticipation, not impatience. Do you remember waiting for a pie to cool, pretending not to, knowing full well you'd burn your tongue anyway? Because joy was worth a little pain. That's what flavour used to mean. Not luxury, not status, but proof that you were alive and surrounded by care. Britain once knew that truth better than anyone. That food was memory you could taste. That comfort could be built from nothing more than flour and love. And yet somehow, as the years passed, we started mistaking convenience for comfort, forgetting that what fills the stomach doesn't always feed the soul. The modern table is clean, symmetrical, cold. But once, it was a battlefield of crumbs, spills, laughter, and forgiveness. You didn't need words to say you were sorry. You just passed the salt or offered the last slice. There was beauty in imperfection, in burnt edges and uneven slices that carried fingerprints of care. Now everything tastes the same. Processed, polished, afraid of emotion. As if we've engineered the human out of hunger. Do you think we could ever go back to waiting, to savouring, to being fully present for the simple act of eating? Once, a meal was an agreement. I'll make this, you'll stay, we'll share what we have and make it enough. The value wasn't in ingredients, but in intention. The kind of quiet generosity that builds worlds invisible to markets and machines. Britain's kitchen tables were once round for a reason, so no one sat at the head and everyone had a place. That shape said everything about who we were. Equal in effort, equal in hunger, equal in hope. There were no influencers, no cameras, no applause. Just the soft sound of spoons against plates and stories told half-finished because laughter got in the way. Those moments built us far more than politics or wars ever did. But we let them vanish as if they were ordinary. They weren't. They were the soul of a nation disguised as dinner. So what do we feed ourselves with now? Convenience, content, distraction. Can a phone screen fill the same space a loved one's voice once did? We scroll through recipes we'll never cook. Chasing inspiration while starving for connection. And yet the cure has always been the same. A table, a chair, 2 cups, and the courage to stop pretending we're too busy to be human. Because the taste of Britain isn't a flavour you can package or export. It's a rhythm, a way of gathering, a promise to show up even when the cupboards are bare. If you've ever shared the last biscuit, if you've ever stretched a meal to include one more person, you already know what I mean. We are what we share. Not what we own, not what we post, but what we offer when no one's watching. And maybe that's the point the modern world keeps missing. That the future isn't built in factories or screens, but in kitchens that still smell of stories. When the oven light glows against the dark and someone says, "Sit down, love, it's ready," the world, for one small, perfect moment, makes sense again. Because that's where the real history lives. Not in museums or parliaments, but in the warmth that rises from a plate, and the silence that follows the first grateful bite. And if we could remember that, really remember it, maybe Britain could taste like home again. Maybe the world began to change when recipes stopped being whispered and started being printed, when the knowledge of taste moved from hearts to pages, from people to packaging, from hands that remembered to screens that forgot. There was a time when flavour wasn't taught. It was inherited, absorbed, lived. The way a child learns to recognize their mother's voice without ever being told how. You didn't need a timer or a thermometer, you just knew. You could tell when the roast was ready by the sound of the fat crackling, by the smell sneaking under the kitchen door, by instinct honed over generations. We traded that kind of knowing for convenience, for blinking lights and digital certainty. And somewhere in that exchange, something ancient slipped quietly away. What does it mean to lose a sense, not of smell or taste, but of patience? To live in a world that never gives things time to become beautiful on their own. Every great British dish, every pudding, every pie, every slow-cooked miracle was a lesson in faith. You couldn't rush a stew any more than you could rush trust or love. It demanded waiting, it demanded care. We can rebuild the future the same way we once rebuilt this country. One meal, one table, one act of care at a time. Because every generation hungers for something real, something that lasts, something that reminds them who they are. And when all the noise dies down, when the plates are cleared and the lights go out, what remains isn't progress or profit, it's connection. That quiet knowledge that someone fed you, someone waited for you, someone wanted you there. That's Britain's flavour. Not sweet, not bitter, but human. The kind that lingers long after the taste is gone, warm as memory, steady as time. And maybe that's how we'll find our way back. Not through invention or nostalgia, but through the oldest recipe of all. Care made, visible. So let the kettle boil, let the table be set. Let the world slow down long enough to feel familiar again. Because the Britain we miss isn't lost. It's waiting, patient as always, right where we left it. In the sound of spoons, in the smell of supper, in the echo of voices saying softly, "You'll stay for tea, won't you?" That's the story worth keeping. That's the one worth tasting forever. Now, we outsource that intimacy to strangers and machines, calling it progress because it's fast and clean. But nothing about real life is clean. It's messy, it spills, it burns, it clings. And maybe that's exactly what we've forgotten. That the best things always leave a mark. When did we decide that hands were meant to be idle? That work should never smell of butter or smoke or joy? Our grandparents didn't have much, but they had flavour. And that meant they had memory, connection, or identity. They didn't eat to escape life. They ate to live it more deeply. To anchor themselves in a world that was constantly shifting beneath their feet. Every cup of tea was an act of resistance against hurry. Every shared plate, a small rebellion against loneliness. What would it take to bring that back? To teach a new generation that cooking isn't a task, but a language. That a recipe isn't instruction, it's inheritance. That taste isn't chemistry, it's culture. Perhaps all that's needed is to start again. Not with new ingredients, but with old intentions. To peel the potatoes, to stir the soup, to wait. And in waiting, remember. Because time is the only spice we can't replace, the only flavour we can't fake. The Britain that once knew that truth is still here, beneath the noise, waiting to be tasted again. Somewhere, buried beneath the hum of a modern life, that old Britain still breathes. Not in museums or recipes, but in the muscle memory of a nation that once knew how to care without saying a word. You can still feel it in the way a stranger offers a biscuit with your tea, or the way a friend says, "Go on, have the last one," and means it, even if they wanted it to. Hospitality here was never grand. It was humble, almost invisible. The kind that lived in half gestures and second helping. The warmth wasn't in the food itself, but in the pause. That sacred moment before someone takes their first bite and knows they belong. Isn't that what we've been missing all along? That sense of belonging, that soft reassurance that we are not alone. Once, Britain's strength wasn't in steel or empire, but in kettle steam and kindness, in the small courtesies that stitched whole communities together. The postman got a slice of cake, the neighbour got a spare plate, and no one went home empty-handed. It wasn't charity, it was custom. The unwritten rule that no table was ever truly full. Do you remember the smell of rain and frying bacon in the morning? That feeling that everything, absolutely everything, was going to be fine. That's what flavour does. It tells the truth before words can. Now, our senses are dulled by speed, by noise, by the glare of too much everything and the taste of almost nothing. We scroll past recipes, watch strangers eat, but can't remember the last time a meal made us feel known. There's irony in that. A nation once built on sharing, now afraid of silence, of sitting too long, of waiting for water to boil. Yet deep down, we still ache for it. The clatter of plates, the laughter that interrupts grace, the comfort of something bubbling slowly in the next room. Maybe progress wasn't supposed to mean forgetting. Maybe the future doesn't need to be tasteless. We could still learn from the past, not by recreating it, but by remembering why it mattered. What if the next great innovation isn't faster but slower? What if the most radical thing we can do is cook for someone, without cameras, without proof, just because it feels right? Imagine Britain rediscovering that rhythm. Markets full again, ovens warming kitchens, voices rising over the sound of boiling kettles. Imagine food that remembers who we are, not just what we want. Every nation has its myths, but ours were baked, brewed, and served at tables that never made the news. A cup of tea could forgive an argument, a slice of pie could make peace without words. The magic was never in ingredients, it was in intent. That's why even now, decades later, one taste can undo years of forgetting. You take a bite of something simple, toast, stew, apple crumble, and suddenly the world makes sense again. The walls feel closer, the air warmer, and you remember that history isn't a list of dates, it's a collection of dinners. Perhaps that's what Britain gave the world without even trying. The art of comfort, the courage of routine, the poetry of the ordinary. And maybe the greatest loss of all isn't empire or industry, but the ability to sit, to savor, to stay. But it isn't gone, not yet. It's waiting in every pantry and every cupboard, in every person who still asks, "You'll stay for tea, won't you?" Because as long as that question exists, so does Britain. Not the Britain of maps and headlines, the real one, built on warmth, on flavour, on people who never stopped offering the best of themselves quietly, again and again. So maybe this story isn't about food at all. Maybe it's about memory, and how easily we let it fade when the world convinces us that fast is better than full. Because every taste we lose is a story untold, a hand unremembered, a small kindness left behind in the rush toward tomorrow. Britain once built its identity not on conquest, but on cups of tea served in crisis, on sandwiches made in silence after bad news, on casseroles carried down the street to doors that wouldn't open for anyone else. We think of history as parliaments and battles, but the real history, the living kind, was written in kitchen. What we cooked defined how we cared, and how we cared defined who we were. A nation that could survive on ration books and still make the room for guests, that's not poverty, that's poetry. It takes courage to feed people when you're unsure there's enough to go around. And that courage is what shaped us. Somewhere in our DNA, between thrift and tenderness, that instinct still hums. It's in the way we apologize with a kettle, in the way we comfort with a plate. Even now, in this bright and hurried age, we still pause for tea. Still trust that warmth and time can fix almost anything. So the question isn't whether we've lost our traditions, it's whether we're ready to taste them again. To remember that the smell of toast can heal, that the sound of cutlery can calm, that food, real food, is a kind of faith. And maybe that's what we need now, more than ever. Faith in the slow, the simple, the sincere.